So the base component to this obviously is Migration Manager, the components. So not only the Migration Manager console and the directory synchronization agent, but also the Resource Update Manager console that gets installed by default as part of the Migration Manager console. There's another utility called PowerRum, which was introduced a couple versions ago that allows us to use PowerShell to automate some of the workstation migration processes. And then there's their self-service portal, which is the piece that we'll be focusing on today. And the portal really leverages PowerRum to create tasks and schedule tasks that then get reflected within the Resource Update Manager. So although some of the work that you would be doing would be in the self-service portal, you can always refer back to the Resource Update Manager console and see that activity or see those logs represented there. And then there's some components that need to be added so we can collect some data. So there is a small exe through a command file or a batch file that should be deployed via GPO to collect some data, workstation, software, profile information, stuff like that. So we'll talk about all of those pieces. You guys are familiar with the Migration Manager console, right? You've seen it somewhat? Okay. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here. In my lab, obviously, I've got minimal resources and stuff. I have a synchronization job configured that is looking for any user that has extension attribute1 equals Alex is included in scope. I've selected a number of OUs where we can pick our objects from. I've also allowed the DSA to create objects, so we can either allow it to create objects as they are, we can do migration sessions to manipulate attributes such as send account name, display name, whatever you might have. So that's really the only important piece here is that we have some synchronization going or some migration sessions going. The second component was the Resource Update Manager console, which is this. Right now there is nothing in here. What needs to be configured in this console is the credentials that we would use. And so you'll notice that I have the same set of credentials as far as the account, but registered them a little bit differently with NetBIOS and then FQDN. And we do this because sometimes machines don't like to use NetBIOS or whatever the case might be. And if you try to parse the permissions over with FQDN, those credentials aren't embedded, and so you get some failures. So we add all of these so that we have any combination that you might have. So if you guys have 13 domains, you might have 26 or more registered entries here. So as you can see in this console right now, there's no workstations that have been configured. There's nothing added to here. Right? This is all going to be done on the background. From an install perspective of the utility, I'm working with the developer to make it a bit more automated and less risk of mistakes being made. So right now, it requires us to manually create a SQL database, manually run a couple of SQL queries to populate the tables. There's a MSI file that adds additional tables to those SQL database, registers a service. Then we have to manually add a couple of application pools within IIS and assign the permissions and do some manual configuration. So I've asked that all of that be included in the install file so we don't have that risk of accidentally forgetting something or misconfiguring something. From a client perspective, it's really not a big deal if we do it, right? Because once it's set up, you shouldn't have to redo it, right? So it's just that initial setup that I'm concerned about to make sure that it's automated. So once we get all those pieces together, we have our self-service portal, which looks like this. Again, I'll talk about some of the important pieces and some of the pieces that I'm having them work on. So the first thing we need to do is we need to set up our domain pair within the tool. And this is just some basic information as to the source and target domains, DCs. This is the source domain GUID, so the first part of the SID, if you will, of the domain. The workstation container, we found that if we pointed it to the actual computer container, which is not an OU, then it would fail because it doesn't respect it as being an OU. So we selected an alternative OU that is actually an OU. So depending on how we build out the target environment for you guys, we might specify a temporary OU or a placeholder OU, whatever you want to call it, where these workstations would be directed. So there's some limitation in that we can't select an OU at the time of the move. It's kind of a big bang type of thing. You could theoretically stop the service, update this configuration, and then start the service again, but you would be doing that kind of quite repetitively. And since this is really self-service, we wouldn't have any way of identifying or controlling who's going where, right? So it's not like we could make changes on the fly for everybody if 100 people have registered to migrate. So probably should select just a temporary OU for these workstations to be added to. The other piece that I like is the fact that we can have the tool enable or disable the source or target accounts during this process. So typically best practice would be to have your target accounts disabled so that the users aren't accidentally logging into that target environment. So this tool will allow us to, once that user selects to be migrated, the code will go ahead and enable that target account and disable that source account if needed. The scheduled grouping attribute is an attribute that you can use to leverage how you want users to be identified for migration. In this example, we're using, I think it's the city code, which is L as the attribute, and that will designate an attribute value for that. So anybody that falls into that is considered in scope and can be migrated. This can be any attribute that we select. So if it's an extension attribute, something like that, we can select that and add its code. So configuration is not too tough. We have some time frame settings, so we can set here a schedule on when we want users to be able to migrate, how many workstations we allow during that time, and then it will actually count as people are registering to migrate their workstations. And then how many are remaining. So you can set this up to 500, you can set this up to 150, whatever we want. What will happen there is if you set it to say 100, and you send out 500 emails saying, hey, you're scheduled to be migrated, the first 100 people that register will be allowed for that day. The others would have to set an alternative day. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the self-service part that the user sees. The group parameters are the same thing, so here's the attribute that we're looking for, right? So the attribute that we identified before is the city. We want this to be Chicago. So if it was extension attribute 4 and we say migrate, we would add those values here. And so we put the dates that they're allowed to migrate, start to migrate, and the last date that they're allowed to migrate, and then how many they can migrate per day. Any questions so far? So this will be identified by, in this example, the city. So as long as anybody here, come on, has Chicago, then they'll be included as in scope. Right, so if we identify all the users that we want to migrate, we can stamp, again, any attribute, put a value to it, and then they're identified as ones that are able to be migrated. Somewhat. Okay. Yes, that's correct. And again, it can be any attribute. So if you're doing it by region or something like that, or all the users are identified by a particular attribute, and I think, and I'll validate this, that we might be able to use some of the custom attributes that you guys are using. So if you have a custom attribute that everybody that's to be migrated has, we could leverage something like that. Sure. So also note in this example, this user count in the source is enabled, and this user count and the target is disabled. Okay, so that's the state of those two. So we got our domain pairs. There's some configuration that can be done that I've noticed that I would probably make the changes. I haven't made them yet, but this allows you to configure some of the verbiage used through some of the messages the users might see. The ones that I was most concerned about are just some of the language. I think in a couple of these, and really it's the developer is in South America, so his primary language I think is Portuguese, so his English writing is not necessarily what we would expect. So easy enough to change so that the user can, get to the proper message. The user workstation report we won't talk about right now because it's there's nothing really to report at this point. We haven't done anything. And these other windows allows you to kind of track what's been happening. Again, right now there's nothing there because we haven't done any migrations. So there's nothing really to show. So a couple of things that we need to do from the self-service portal piece is we need to start the service. And then we need to enable the domain pair. Okay, so now the portal is ready to operate. What we really need to do now is, from the workstation perspective, I mentioned that we needed to have this file run, right? This little exe. So I'm not running this via GPO here in my lab. I just copied the files locally. So these would be the two files that we would copy. Basically, this is just executing this exe, right? Pointing it to the migration manager console and the portal itself. So when we run this, this is going to go and collect all this user information and workstation information. And so when we get back to the console and do preparation for workstation moves, we do a select all computers. So this query actually goes out and queries Active Directory. It doesn't go out and query every workstation within Active Directory. It queries Active Directory. So this will give us a list of all of the machines within the domain. So you can imagine for you guys it's going to be a very long list, right? We can select to exclude some servers, exclude from scope, elect a computer. Again, this is some of the work that previously we would have to go through and identify the workstation to be migrated, elect it to be migrated, and that could be a very arduous task if you've got 30, 40,000 machines, and you have to have an accurate user to workstation mapping to identify which workstation is getting mapped, right? That to me was not a very good self-service portal approach. So I had them change it so that it was more user-driven, and then that would be reflected here in the console. So we see all the machines that we have available for migration. So we'll go back to the workstation, to initiate this migration. And let's see if I remember it correctly. So the user gets directed to this page. So initially, my approach would be the users to be migrated are identified. They get an email with some small instructions and a link that would take them here. Right? So we're not just saying, hey, go out and do this on your own. We're actually directing them via email, maybe giving them some time frames, whatever you want to do. So we select to migrate the computer. So the request has been completed, right? So if we go back to the Migration Manager console, we'll see that now this machine is a migration candidate, right? I didn't do anything to it except for the user initiated it. It now became a candidate, so it's now within the candidates. Let me see, I'd have to run that again. I think I ran this before the service was running. So now we have a list of all the profiles that have been logged into this workstation. All right, so if we need to identify this for whatever reason, right? We know we've got shared machines, stuff like that. And it also gives you a list of software, patches, stuff like that that has been collected. So we have some useful data maybe. You can see now that the process has already started. It's already done its discovery, and now it's doing its resource processing. Again, all user initiated. I haven't done anything to kick any of this off. We can also see that here in the console, our workstation gets registered, and it shows that we are in progress of doing the processing. Yes. Yep, it's coming down the road. So what the next step would be, that I've asked the developer to do is that once this is done resource processing, that it automatically generates an email and sends the user a follow-up email saying the machine is ready to be migrated, direct it back to that web page, and then complete the migration. So now I don't have to go and tell the user anything. The system's automatically going to do that. So this is the piece that the developer's working on. Do I have it up? Yeah, so this is the piece. Here's some of the code that still needs to be developed, where we're just providing the SMTP server name, stuff like that. The invitation verbiage to, from, what's going to happen. So this piece is still being worked on, but so I felt that it needed to be a little bit more, the process needed to flow a little bit more without interruption of either the migration engineer or the user. So getting this all to flow is much better. There's also some other things that I asked them to do, and that was to make sure that the net logon service and the remote registry service were both enabled and running. So the code does that already. If that service is stopped, it will enable it and start it. So now we see that the workstation has been processed, right? It says okay. We can go within the console and view its logs, right? See what happened. Everything was good. If we go back to the self-service portal, we'll see that the progress is completed. So at this point, the user should get that second email. They should be directed back to that web page. Let me see, what's today's date? The 17th? Okay, so let me just adjust something real quick, because I think in my yeah, let me add a new one because it doesn't have. So let's say 16th to 20th, limit 10, save. Hopefully my adjustment here will take effect. Okay, that's what I wanted to see. So we have two options. We have the migrate now, or we have the schedule. And so the schedule will show us available dates and when we can schedule it. Right? So we can select a date if we want, select time zone, select a period of time, and then schedule that. Right? And so on that date, if the machine, assuming the machine's online, it will migrate that machine. The alternative, which is what I'd rather see, is to have the migrate now. So I hit migrate now, I hit start, and then it's going to go through the process. So even though it appears, and this is kind of some of the code that I also wanted to update, it appears that it's doing a discovery again and doing a processing again. It's just kind of validating those steps. So this will take a minute or so. So the machine completed the move task, and now it's going to be rebooted. So this is, I think it's at a 60-second. The other piece that I've asked to either have removed or updated is the ability to request a rollback. I'd rather the user not have this option right out of the gate. Like, why would I want to roll back? You know, you haven't done anything. And I think, in my opinion, if there's a rollback that's required, it really should be investigated and identified first before we just arbitrarily roll it back. So I'd like to see this piece be removed from this window. If the migration's a failure, then I would say have a message saying that the machine did not successfully migrate. Maybe have a link that initiates an email to the migration team with some computer information, and that the machine failed, and then that team can then remediate that machine. So the machine's rebooting. If we go back to the console, Well, so if the migration failed, there is no rolling back, right? Because they didn't join the domain successfully. So the machine would still be in the source domain. We just need to identify why it failed and then give notice to the migration team that it failed and something needs to be done. There has to be a really good reason to roll the machine back. Yes, right now I would like to take that ability out of the user's control because I don't want someone to arbitrarily say, hey, you know, this application didn't work for me, let me just roll my machine back. And now we're like, well, why did you roll it back? Right? I'd rather fix the problem and move forward than roll any machines back ever. So that's why I want to remove that ability from the user to not be able to do that. So if we go back to the console, we'll see that the workstation now is reflected to be in the target domain. The move was successful, so we have some reporting there. If we look at AD, we'll see that the account became enabled. And I think I have the account get disabled here. Account gets disabled. So that takes, again, that task from the migration engineer out of the picture. They don't have to worry about doing the migration session to enable and disable those accounts. If we go back to the workstation, workstation's up, it's joined the domain. You can see that it's now reflecting the target. I've asked that he change this to reflect just the NetBIOS name because I don't want your users to think they have to type go.johnsoncontrols.com if they ever want to use UPN, right? So it should just be target backslash. And our synchronization synchronized our password, so our password is the same. We're back to our same desktop. We have the files that we had on here before. So the user experience, they should just keep on trucking, right? Migration's complete. And then there's some reporting that can be done in here. Okay, so that was already been migrated, so it's going on a candidate. Alright, here's the migrated. You can restart a migration if you need to. So you have some control over it. There's still some reporting that needs to be taken care of. Like this piece here is not reporting properly, so we need to make sure that the migrations as they're being elected or selected and completed, that they are being reflected here, so we can report to say, you know, how many machines are migrated, how many have gone, stuff like that. So this is still a couple pieces of the code that needs to be worked on. And that's about it. I mean, I like the product as it is right now. Like I said, I've been working with the developer to tweak some of those processes to make it a little more streamlined, get some of those automated emails going, get some of the reporting going. Is there anything that you guys see or would like to see included in this? I know you mentioned the rollback component. Again, I think that should be a longer discussion because I don't ever want to give the user the ability to roll back on their own. Um, that might be too much process to add some approval process to that. If the machine needs to be rolled back, really, again, I think that's something that the migration team needs to be involved with. And at that point, I can go to the migration console and move that computer back myself. From my experience, I roll back very, very few machines. In the thousands of machines that I've migrated, I've rolled back very few of them. I don't believe in rolling back. I believe in moving forward, fixing forward. So I don't want to give the users that control to do that, and I don't want to give the users the ability to get an approval to do that. It should be reported as a help desk incident, investigated as to what the problem is, and fix the problem. Because other than that, there's really no reason to roll back a machine. If the machine failed, it would fail by having a default profile, for instance. So that would be a reason to roll back the machine, reprocess it, and then migrate it again. But something like, oh, I can't connect to this application right now, is not a reason to roll it back. That machine needs to move to the target domain, that application needs to be identified and remediated, configured, tweaked, or whatever, so that that connection to that application can be made. If it's something like, you have to put a host file entry on the workstation, then so be it. Whatever has to be done. But eventually, ultimately, that machine needs to be moved to the target domain, and so does the user. And so we need to identify what that problem is and fix that problem. And I shouldn't expect, and I hope that you guys don't expect that you're going to migrate 500 machines and 60 of them need to be rolled back. If that type of thing is happening, there is a problem in the process. And we need to identify what's happening, fix that problem. You don't want to do this every migration. So other than the rolling back, do you see anything else?